All right. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome everyone during this beautiful yet potentially challenging time in a mother's life. Today's talk, Navigating the Shadows, will provide a comforting space to explore these challenges and discover paths to emotional wellness. As the moderator, let me introduce myself first. I am Dr. Danielle. I'm an OBGYN in the Air Force and founder of Honey, a platform offering comprehensive postpartum support to moms and dads. Honey empowers families through medical education, personalized coaching, and postnatal depression screening with intervention. So if you or a loved one needs additional support in the postpartum period, please scan the QR code that you saw in the previous slide. Access is free. We got you. Now, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Doriana Alfred. Dr. Alfred is a licensed psychologist specializing in perinatal mental health. She owns Works of Faith Wellness and Consultation in Columbus, Ohio, and is passionate about promoting mental health equity for pregnant, postpartum individuals. Her practice offers clinical services, workshops, and support for families pregnant, postpartum, and who have experienced infant loss. Please feel free to make notes of any questions you have for Dr. Alfred or myself during the talk. I will be collecting these and will ask a selection of them, combining those with similar themes for a focused discussion at the end. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Dr. Alfred.
Hello, thank you for that warm welcome, Dr. Wright Terrell. Again, my name is Dr. Alfred, and I am really just pleased to be here with you to have this conversation. And I know we're in a webinar, but I really want it to be as interactive as possible. So at various points, I'm going to ask you to put information in the chat. And you can just put it there and I'll take a look and kind of respond to that. But I really also want to thank you for the opportunity to be here for Safer Births, appreciating that. And then also appreciating the fact that all of those of you who showed up. This is such an important topic for us to cover and really can have life-saving benefits. So I'm so glad that you took time to invest in this particular topic today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So in terms of what you can expect from today, I'm going to spend some time framing our conversation with some background information and then kind of segueing into really looking at the impact of perinatal mental health complications. And of course, we'll focus in on postpartum depression specifically. So we'll really do an overview and get more specifics about that particular topic. And then we'll talk about accessing treatment and support. And then again, have time at the end for conversation. So, as we start this conversation, one of the things I wanted to do was to really bring voice to those who have struggled with postpartum depression and even perinatal depression, perinatal being that time during pregnancy as well as that first year after giving birth. So when we think about postpartum depression, it can really feel like this shadow that follows you, that hangs over you, this darkness that's there. And really, sometimes we don't have a really good sense of why. It just feels like it's there. And so when we are in the shadows, or for those of us who have experienced perinatal or postpartum depression, including myself during my pregnancies, it really can be almost a surreal experience. And so one of the things that I want to do is just go over a few of these quotes, and then we're going to come back to these same quotes later in terms of how do we respond when someone says these words to us or says other things that may be difficult for us to balance or manage. One person said, "I feel so sad. I cry all the time and I don't even know why. I feel like I can't do anything right. He, the baby, is always crying and nothing I do seems to help. I don't even know who I am anymore. I know I should be able to do this. It's my responsibility to take care of her, the baby. I'm not depressed. I take care of my baby every day, even when I'm tired." So as we kind of walk through and we start to frame this, to really start to think about, okay, being in this particular space, what would that be like for someone, whether that's you personally or someone you know? And then how do we help someone navigate that? That's really what we want to spend time talking about. So when we look at maternal or perinatal mental health conditions, they are the most common complication associated with pregnancy and childbirth, affecting over 800,000 estimated people in the United States. And that's really important because sometimes we can feel like, okay, that's something that is not very common. It doesn't happen to a lot of people. It is actually the most common complication. And when we talk about maternal mental health complications, that does include things like anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, so a whole host of conditions. Although for today's topic, we're going to really just focus in mostly on postpartum depression. But it is important to know this is something a lot of people deal with. It's important for us to understand that because it can really help us with also navigating and combating some of the stigma that comes along with having experiences such as postpartum depression. So what we know is that about 1 in 5 moms or birthing people will experience a perinatal mental health complication. So that does include both things like depression, anxiety, and the whole spectrum of them. But we know that number 1 in 5 can actually be as much as 1 in 3 for some individuals. And so it's important to really think about that. If we look at even the people who are tuned into this call, 1 in 5 So it really just helps give some context for any room that you're in, thinking about, wow, this is the frequency with which someone might be experiencing a mental health complication. And also importantly, when mental health complications impact someone, it's not just that individual, right? It's the person who's pregnant as well as that family unit, because everyone is affected. And so we see that 1 in 10 partners, the research is specific to dads, but we'll extend that to include all partners, can be also affected by a perinatal mental health complication. We know that Black and Indigenous childbearing individuals have higher rates of postpartum depression than other racial groups. And some research has estimated that 50% of Black moms may have some form of postpartum depression. 50%. Now that's a high number, but I think it begs the question of what's going on and why is this the case? Why are there these higher rates? And then for single Black moms, the Maternal Mental Health Leadership Alliance, their data has suggested that single Black moms may be at even greater risk. So again, we really want to keep asking ourselves, why is that? What's happening here? Living in a rural community, having less income, being younger can also put a person more at risk, as well as those who identify as LGBTQ2S+. So lots of ways that people can be impacted. And we really, again, we want to kind of start to ask the question, what is happening? What is going on? The work that we do and why it is so critically important that we be able to support and identify, more importantly, those who are experiencing postpartum depression is we literally have the ability to save lives. We can intervene if we know, we can support if we know. You heard me mention the statistics earlier about 1 in 5 individuals having a perinatal mental health complication. But what we also know is about 25% of people who actually need the help are getting it. So fewer people are getting help than needed. So there really is a lot of work for us to do in terms of being able to identify those who may be struggling with depression, if it's ourselves or if it's someone else. So today we're really going to talk about how can we identify, how can we point out, how can we learn, how can we even discuss with someone who we think may have postpartum depression so that we can get them connected to the resources that they need. So related to postpartum depression, we know that there are statistics that state that perinatal suicide and overdose are a leading cause of pregnancy-related deaths. Now, just letting that sit for a minute, this is a time when many people would say, someone who's pregnant or just had a baby, like, oh my gosh, this is the best time of your life, and this is such an exciting time, and gosh, you should be so happy that you've got this baby, all of these things, and so it seems so counter to have this statistic that is saying that is not the case for some moms and birthing people. And we want to understand why. And more importantly, we want to be able to do what we can to support people who may be experiencing depression so that they can get the support that they need for themselves and for their families. One of the other interesting things about perinatal suicide is the statistic that it generally occurs between 6 weeks and 1 year after birth. And so just really quickly in the chat, I'm going to take a look for that. But I really want to know how many people can say or guess when the postpartum visit, when is the last time you have your postpartum visit? What's that range? So anyone. How many weeks following birth? Okay, I see 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months. So some variety there Any others that we'd add? So, for some people, many people that 12 weeks or less, but the time period 6 weeks to 1 year means that sometimes people are at more risk after they're no longer seeing their OB. And so it is really important just for that general follow-up. And we do know that pediatricians are also screening and doing assessments. And that's really important because we want to be able to support people and identify people who do need the support and help. Because what we see next is that while 20% of the deaths that occur in postpartum are from suicide, about 80% of those have been deemed preventable. And that is from a segment of data from the US. So keeping that information in context. And then there can be a higher risk for suicide for those who have used substances prenatally. And particularly, there seems to be a link, although I think there's a need for more research for that, for opioid use. So it's also good for us to just kind of keep these things in mind as we think about who may have more risk. So also thinking about special subsets of the population, we have our military independent moms. So those are dependents, of course, are those individuals who may be married to someone in the military. And these are some statistics that come from, again, the Maternal Mental Health Leadership Alliance. They have a mental health fact sheet for veterans. And this data is showing that so actual military personnel, so those who are themselves serving in the military, an estimate of 35% reported perinatal mental health complications, and then 50% of those whose spouses were deployed. So there was an increased risk for that. And then some of the challenges that may make those individuals who are serving more likely to experience are really just the military life deployments, access to care that is specialized depending on where a person is. And Dr. Wright Terrell, if you don't mind chiming in, if there's any information that you would like to share or even just kind of contextualize for us on that, that would be great. If not, no worries, but I wanted to give you the opportunity, especially given your background.
Yeah, so again, I am an OBGYN active duty in the Air Force. My daughter is 1.5 now. What the military does right for active duty individuals, so the birthing person, I got 18 weeks of leave. So I felt like I had a good enough time and was supported by the military to be able to be at home, support my daughter. My husband is not military. He only got 4 weeks of leave. So the military isn't necessarily in control of that. And so in terms of family unit support, when you have dual active duty or just one, a single active duty, um, some of the things that are out of our control, particularly family dynamics, can certainly lead to some of the stressors that you alluded to earlier and contribute to postpartum depression. Um, and I guess that is the context that I can provide. I can answer any more questions if anyone has them, but certainly it depends on the branch that the family is in,
Mm.
more harder in terms of deployments. Air Force is a bit more generous, so there's a little bit more background that goes into it. But I think that overall, military members have spoken up, and really great policy changes have happened over the past 5 years or so to support families way better than what they were doing 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I did include the Military Independent Moms Act of 2024, which has been introduced to further develop what is available in terms of support. So we are glad to see that this particular group is being highlighted and services specialized services are being provided. So let's delve into when we talk about postpartum depression, what are we actually talking about? What is it? So what we are talking about is a depressive episode that occurs during pregnancy or in that first year following birth. So the postpartum part obviously is the part after birth. We look at in terms of diagnosing for someone having persistent symptoms for at least 2 weeks. And really importantly too is the impact on the person's functioning. So it is more than like baby blues where that first couple of weeks, I may not feel myself, I may feel out of sorts, I may feel sad, and then things seem to improve. This is really more of a persistent state and an actual depressive episode. And I'll go into some more about what those symptoms look like. What's really important, I think, to know about this is you really can't tell just by looking at someone if they're depressed. So sometimes we can encounter someone and say, oh my gosh, you're doing so great. And we mean well. And I think it can be encouraging, but it doesn't mean that that person isn't depressed because they don't look like it. They look well, they look put together. And so sometimes we have to really kind of look a little bit deeper. And especially if, we are a loved one who might be looking, or we might be a doula or birth worker, or even a provider, we want to be able to go beyond what we see on the surface. And to related to that, function and impairment can vary. We have people who go to work every day and who may be having depression and depressive symptoms. And so we can't just, kind of go off of, okay, well, they seem okay. They go to work every day. They didn't report necessarily anything, but sometimes a person may function well in one setting or environment and really struggle in another one. So it is also important to think about that. So what I may do when I am at work or when other people are around may be different than when I'm home after work or I am home alone. And so it can be a little bit difficult to get to how is a person really doing. And so that's why it really is so important as we think about how do we support people, even including ourselves if we're struggling, is to develop trusting relationships with people so that we feel safe to disclose when we are struggling. And then really importantly, to know is that recovery is achievable. So it's not just, I will be struggling, I have this thing. You can recover from postpartum depression. And we are going to talk about some of the things that can help us in that recovery. So these are typical symptoms of what depression looks like. And this is for anyone. So it doesn't matter who it is, and it doesn't have to be specific to the postpartum period. So anyone that I might meet or work with, I would be assessing depressive symptoms from from this list. So most often people are, understand that like sadness or crying, they might identify depression with that. But they may not understand that that irritability, anger, or rage could also be part of the symptoms for postpartum depression. And again, just imagine as we, start to begin to look at specifically postpartum symptoms, you have a new baby. You have a new person that you are fully responsible for taking care of. And if you're having any number of these symptoms, how might that feel? And also, to what extent might I be willing to share some of these things that I might be feeling? How easy do you think it is for someone to really, when you look just at this list, if I have to say, I'm feeling hopeless. Would that be an easy thing for me to share? Go ahead and just in the chat, again, would like a little bit of interaction with the platform that we have. So do you think it would be easy? And if not, why do you think it's hard for people to say, I might have depression. I am feeling overwhelmed. I am feeling angry. Just a few comments in the chat. Stigma. Thank you, Marie. Any other vulnerability? Mhm. Absolutely. Again, this is a hard thing. And then we're going to talk about a little bit more about, again, what it means. These are just, again, general symptoms of depression, signs of weakness. Thank you. I see that, Wanda. Fear. Absolutely. Oh, I want to know more about fear. Oh, somebody said, Farida said religion. Oh, wish we could unmute so we could have some real conversation about that. But these are really important things, and absolutely fear of rejection. And so if postpartum depression is so common, right? It's pretty common, 1 in 5. Then you really can see why, if this thing that is common, but also may be really laden for me to even share because of fears of stigma or fear of rejection, or any of those things that you all mentioned. It's really imperative that we really try to understand and connect with moms and birthing people around how they are really doing. Right. Okay. So some of these other things, all of these are pretty straightforward, probably things that you've seen. So now we're going to kind of start to transition and look at what happens specifically with postpartum. So when we think about just depression in general, some of those symptoms, then what becomes more specific and more challenging about postpartum depression? Before I do that, I want to just quickly highlight sleep disruption. Did you see that as a common symptom of depression? After you have a baby, what's likely to be one of the most common things that you have? Sleep disruption, right? And of course, everybody tells you, well, sleep when the baby sleep. And that is not always feasible, and that doesn't work for everyone. And so it is both an experience that people might have just generally after they've had a baby, and also may be a symptom of depression, as well as those changes in appetite. So those are, I just wanted to highlight, it can be really difficult. Also, the changes in personal care. Some of us will say, it was a win if I got a shower today. And so sometimes those changes are just a function of, excuse me, I'm caring for someone, feels like 24 hours, especially with those early, depending on the feeding cycle. And so it could be just perceived as, well, this is just kind of part of what happens with a new baby, but it might not be. So when we think about what's different, lots of things can be different about postpartum. So one thing that we don't often acknowledge or recognize is the person's circumstances around a pregnancy. We can't assume that everyone who has a pregnancy, that the circumstances were ideal. And so sometimes they are not ideal, and sometimes can even be out of a trauma. And so understanding that as a potential risk is really important. Some people, and you may relate to this, have this idea of, oh my gosh, what's parenting going to be like? And oh my gosh, having the baby and being so excited. And we may really have this idea of, this is what having a baby, especially first-time parents, this is what having a baby is supposed to be like. And if our experience is not that, that can be really difficult to deal with. And so we can start to develop these negative thoughts about ourselves and our parenting based on this ideal that we had about what it was supposed to be or look like. And so another thing, there is nothing, to me, in my opinion, that brings up parenting challenges, meaning the way you've been parented, than when you become a parent. So for some people, it's when you become a parent, it's all the things you may say, oh my gosh, I love how I was parented. I want to parent that same way. And sometimes you may be like, I don't I'm not going to do that as a parent. I remember having been parented that way, and I don't want to. So, even just how you see yourself as a parent, what you believe you should be doing as a parent, can be something that, if it doesn't fit for you, can be something that people dwell on, or that can be specific to having depression in the postpartum period. Other things, I mentioned sleeping and feeding patterns, even for baby. It's tough. It can be really tough depending on that sleep cycle and the type of support that you have. So those are things that can make symptoms more pervasive, or contribute to a person feeling those symptoms of depression. And other things, and I won't read through all of these, but sometimes how a person feels about and in their body, if that makes sense. And so I will have sometimes people who will talk about, like, well, I'm feeling overweight and this is making me feel bad about myself. But really, they're not necessarily overweight. They've grown a baby. Like, they've grown an entire person, and that is part of the changes of the body. But it's still the feeling, and what it feels like in that person's body can also be a contributing factor. One other thing that I really want to just highlight and focus on is relationship stressors and risk for interpersonal violence. We do know that, of course, there is a relationship for those who have been or are experiencing interpersonal violence, that the risk for depressed mood can be increased. And so these, again, are all things that kind of look different, or that are different for those who experience a depressive episode in the postpartum period. So just things to consider. And of course, I think really importantly is this last one. What if I do tell someone? What's going to happen then? What if I tell someone I'm feeling really depressed? I'm feeling really sad. I don't want to be here anymore. Not necessarily that I want to hurt myself or hurt my baby, although sometimes that could be part of it, but it may just be, I am so overwhelmed. I just want to sleep. If I tell someone that, what will happen to me? What will happen to my baby? So these are things that can exacerbate, because maybe I have awareness that I'm struggling and something's wrong, but I don't know if it's safe for me to get help. And that's a really tough place for parents to be in. And so thinking about, again, who might be more susceptible. So for someone who has a personal, they themselves, or a family history of depression or other mood symptoms, may be more likely to experience postpartum depressive symptoms, which kind of makes sense, right? If you've had depression like in your teens or another part of your life, that there could be just more because of the stress or whatever might have been, causing that depressive episode, that it could happen again, because we talk about depressive episodes because they can occur again. And so certainly, that can make sense. Someone who has a history, and I put a complex trauma, and so that could be more than one trauma, including childhood trauma, relationship trauma, really anything. And that makes sense. If you are in a situation that doesn't feel safe, or you've been in these situations that haven't felt safe, then it would obviously make sense that someone might feel some level of depression. Of course, sensitivity to hormone shifts, that's one of the other things that's kind of unique about the postpartum period, is the body is making so many hormonal shifts that if there is a sensitivity, it can make a person more susceptible. And then history of pregnancy loss. I had a history of early miscarriage as well as stillbirth. And then I had two live births after that. And so my experience with depression and anxiety after in those pregnancies, after my losses, was really something that is almost hard to put into words. And you would think like, oh my gosh, you got pregnant and this one's gonna be okay, or this one's gonna, you're gonna make this one will likely make it here safely, and all of those things that people say well meaning. It still doesn't take away those previous losses. And so having that history can also make someone more susceptible. If you don't have your basic needs met, all of those things, persistent stressors, those things can really contribute also to someone experiencing a depressive episode. And so when we look at, okay, this is what it looks like, but the actual impact, I mentioned before that it is not just the person who is pregnant who is affected by postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, but it's really that whole family unit. And so these are some of the ways that people's lives can be impacted. And you think about it, if I have a pre-existing condition, something that I need medication to manage, or something that I have to exercise to manage, if I have a new baby and I may be experiencing depression, it may make it more difficult for me to do some of those basic care things. It may make it difficult for me to take my medications on time, or keep up with did I even take them. So again, some of this, it's intuitive and it makes sense that it may impact other parts of our lives. Employment sustainability, I'm going to just jump around here a little bit. That transition back to work. Am I ready to go back to work? Do I have to go back to work? All of those types of things can be impacted by a person's mental health in terms of their readiness. Relationship dynamics can change after there has been a baby. Sometimes that bonding is really important, and sometimes you don't have time for each other because the focus is now on the baby. So lots of ways that a person's life, including that bonding and care for baby, can be impacted by someone who has postpartum depression or some other mental health complication. And I'm going to keep going in the interest of time, because I want to make sure we have time for questions, but we can certainly come back to some of these. So what are the things that keep us in the shadows? And we started talking about this a little bit earlier when we talked about why don't people, want to share that they're having depressive symptoms. And these are some additional things that may keep us kind of pulled in the shadows, instead of being able to navigate out or through them. And so really, some people just don't know what depression is. They say, no, I get up every day and I do this, I take care of the baby, I feed the baby, so I'm not depressed. That's not necessarily what that means, because many people function through their depression. And so that functionality piece is one aspect of it, but it may not give us the complete picture. So really importantly, we want to be able to make sure, like if it's your cousin, if it's yourself or your provider, or you're someone supporting, that we know what depression looks like. And we talked about that. What are the symptoms? What exactly does it look like, so that we can share that with someone else? And certainly people may not know what postpartum depression is. So again, really being able to hone in and focus on that. Sometimes we're just too focused on baby's care, and it doesn't feel like we have time to focus on ourselves at all. And that may feel like something that gets in the way. People earlier mentioned some of these other things like stigma. And the stigma is a really challenging one, because it means there's almost two things that have to happen at the same time. We've got to challenge that stigma, or that thinking that's occurring that prevents us from taking steps towards care. And then we have to start taking the steps towards care. So two things have to happen. And sometimes we get stuck over here on still kind of combating whatever that stigma might be. One of the things that I heard even just recently is, this baby is my responsibility. My as in nobody else's. Nobody else can support. By being a good mother, this is what I do. And so if I let other people help me, I'm really not being a good mother. Wow. Like that's a lot that we have to unpack and we have to shift in terms of the thinking before I can even be open to saying, okay, it's okay for me to ask for help. It's okay for me to accept the help that is being given to me. If I, seek mental health services, they're going to think something's wrong with me. They're going to think I'm not fit to be a parent. And what kind of position, again, does that put me in? So maybe I keep that to myself because of stigma or shame, or again, feeling judged. And one of the most challenging things I think for a new parent is wanting to do it right, wanting to feel like you are a good parent, you're taking care of your child, and anything that looks or feels outside of that is really, really challenging. And so sometimes that can. Somebody mentioned, uh, I don't know if they said faith or I think they might have said religion. If you, while I'm talking, could you add a little bit more in the chat to that particular piece? Because I think sometimes that's important that we think about how our faith sometimes can really support us in accessing if we're already connected, like if we, have a faith community that we can connect to, it actually may be an asset to us. But sometimes it can be a challenge of, well, this is kind of not what is aligned with my faith. And my faith suggests that this is how I parent or this is how I access support. And there could be a conflict with that. So yes, thank you. Just pray about it. Anybody heard that one that's familiar? Oh, just pray about it. You'll be fine. And again, people mean well, right? We don't say these things to antagonize people. It may really be an encouragement, but if I really believe I should just pray about this and it's going to be okay, it may get in the way of me connecting to a resource that could help me. And then certainly I mentioned already assumptions about parenthood and sometimes even unrealistic expectations. Can be a challenge. And a big one, which I'll hit on just a little bit in a few minutes, is the lack of trust in care and support systems. If I don't feel like I can trust you, I'm probably not going to ask you to help me, period. And that is the experience that many of us have. And that might not just be, sorry, that might not just be providers. It could be family members. If I don't trust you to come in my house and not shame me because it's not cleaned up, I don't know if I'm going to ask you to come over. Those are the types of things. So outside of an individual, these are some of the other things, and I'm going to wrap up here. These are some of the other things outside of us that really we have to keep into consideration when we are talking about postpartum depression, because we have what an individual's experiences are, but we also have and understand that there are sometimes racist practices and policies and things that are occurring, implicit bias, all of these things that may really impact me accessing support or feeling like I can trust people, feeling like I can really get the support that I need. And so again, I won't go, we've talked a little bit about all of these things, but I thought it is, really important for us to understand there is a context that we live in that may also be contributing. If I don't believe that I have access to basic needs, then it's really going to be difficult for me to see beyond that, and do other things to take care of myself and my family. I'm going to skip the example for now, just in a matter of time. If we have time, we can come back. But I want to just lastly focus on how do we start to come out of the shadows? How do we get ourselves and those that we know and support out of the space of depression and helping support and navigate that recovery? We talk a lot about having a village and supporting, but I would tell you this is probably one of the most challenging things for people to do if they don't already have it. If I have a village already in place, then I can access, and I may feel comfortable enough to access some of that. But if I have to build one, because I don't have supportive people in my life, the people don't show up, this is a really difficult one. And it is also something that can be a really big help. So getting people to even connect, if there's one person, who is that person that I can connect with? Asking and accepting support from people that you trust. It is okay for you to need someone to hold the baby while you do something. It is okay for you to ask someone to come over and your house is not clean. It is okay for your dishes to not be done and the pile of laundry to be on the floor and on the table and wherever else it might be in the house. It's okay. So changing your expectations about what things need to be or what things need to look like. If you are safe and well and fed, if your baby is safe and well and fed and clean, it's all good. It may not feel like it, because some of us will still look at the clothes and look at the things and just be so, and I don't want to make light of it because it can be really anxiety provoking. And if we can really just learn to shift our focus to, am I okay? Is the baby okay? Everything else I can figure out. And doing things, that give you peace, rest when you can, tapping into your faith when it is positive and it is something that encourages you, if it is a scripture, if it is praying. We, a number of people in both the faith and the mental health community will say prayer and therapy. We can have both of those things. And so thinking about how we use and tap into faith in a positive way and augment that with other things that we might need. Last couple of things, show yourself some grace. This is a lot. Parenting is a lot. Early parenting, new parenting, first time can be a lot. So give yourself some grace. Many times we will have a lot of compassion for other people and we won't show that same compassion to ourselves. If we had a friend that was struggling, be like, girl, you're doing okay. Like, just hang in there. Let me know if you need something. You got this. You're doing all right. We will not say those things to ourselves. So sometimes we need to say, girl, you doing good. You got up today, you got the baby's fed, like, okay, that's a win. And so just showing ourselves some grace. And some of these other things I'll leave. I do think it can be really important to talk about therapy. As you can see, I put therapy and antidepressants on there. Obviously, you want to make sure that you understand all your options. And I also want to be clear that there are options even before you choose to or get connected with a therapist. So in the interest of time, the one, I know I keep saying this, I really am about to wrap up. I got 2 minutes. So I'm gonna give myself to 50. I'm going to skip past that. We're going to come back if we can. But I wanted to show you just really quickly 2 screenings. So we talked about how important it is to identify those who might be struggling so that we can put resources and support. So this is just if you go into a doctor's office, you may have seen this one. This is the patient health questionnaire. And then this other one is the Edinburgh. that's typically EPDS, what people will know it as. So you might see it in an electronic form, but these are the forms that many physicians' offices, and Dr. Wright Terrell can certainly chime in here in a minute if there are other things about this, but you will likely, hopefully, get information about one of these assessment tools or something else that is asking you about your symptoms of depression. And so hopefully you are getting one of these once or twice during your pregnancy and after. And whether or not it's that thing in particular, anytime you are getting a screening, it is really for the provider to get information from you about how you're doing. And so that's really the way that they can begin to identify, is there something that we need to look further into? What other resources can we offer? If you are someone who's received one of those screenings and you either don't have information, you don't know what it's about, maybe you don't even feel comfortable, you're not sure if you're going to mark all of the questions exactly how you feel because you're not sure what's happening with it. So again, these screening tools provide those individuals who are providing your care with information about how you're doing. So things that you can do just really generally is ask your provider, if they've not already told you, what does this mean? Like, what did my results say? I completed this form and it asked me some questions. What can you tell me what my results are? What do they mean? And then ask again, as the person who received this or completed the form, ask, and you can even ask before you do it so that you know and you may feel more comfortable responding truthfully and honestly. But what happens if somebody scores high? What happens if someone endorses that item that asks about, have you had thoughts about hurting yourself? What do you do with someone? These are questions that you can ask before you do it, and certainly that you could inquire about afterwards, but also ask about resources. You can ask, what do you offer for people who score high? What if I didn't score high and it looks like I'm okay, but maybe I'm still struggling a little bit? What can you offer me? And then I think it's also important to ask if they have therapists that they refer to, if those therapists have experience in perinatal mental health. Don't necessarily have to have a certification per se, but they have experience and understanding, because there are some unique needs of those who are pregnant postpartum. So those are some resources to share. The list is not exhaustive, but I will stop sharing so we can have some conversation. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and participation so far.
Amazing. So for those still on the call, if you have a specific question, there are some specific questions in the Q&A, and I will address those right now. But after we answer these two questions, if you just want to unmute yourself, and the floor is open for you to ask your questions. The first one to Dr. Alfred that we have, do you have to be a licensed therapist? Do you have to be a therapist, licensed mental health professional to be certified in perimental health?
You don't actually. Postpartum Support International, or PSI, they actually have trainings and certifications for prescribers, and then for therapists, and then I believe there's one for doulas and birth workers. Dr. Wright Terrell, I see you shaking your head. Is that your understanding as well? Mhm.
And the next question we have is, and I love this question, is the complexity of pregnancy, I'm going to put in parentheses, the delivery, also a factor? So C-section versus vaginal delivery versus home birth, is that a factor that can influence postpartum depression?
Yes, I think your birth experience in general, and I didn't get a lot into, because as y'all see, I'm already struggling with time. But if it can definitely affect whether or not you experience postpartum depression. It doesn't mean necessarily that any one particular type of birth necessarily will make you more at risk, at least not from my knowledge, but it's really about what was that birth experience like? How did you feel supported? Were there any complications? How were those complications managed? Did you feel listened to? Did you feel heard? Those are the things, kind of regardless of the type of birth experience that you have, that can be, I think, more a factor in whether or not a person experiences postpartum depression.
So now we can open the floor to everyone.
This was beautifully done. I always feel like I'm like, I don't know, there was some show where God talked over the thing and it was like, ah, when I'm not on camera. Thank you, Dr. Dorina, and thank you, Dr. Danielle. I think this was a really, really rich conversation. I know there was someone that did post or I put in the chat that sometimes stigma and not wanting to be judged. What are some, can you give us maybe talking points, or how do we address that when we are in a community where it's almost frowned upon if you seek outside counsel, right? If you and I say this as a bishop's daughter, so please bear with me, but if you are not leaning into your faith, right? And someone and you go to a mental health professional, how do you handle that if someone says, well, talk to one of the mothers in the church and you'd really rather go talk to Dr. Dorina?
One of the things that I think is really important for us to do is to try to meet people where they are and not like try to push against the resistance. If someone is open to like just learning more about what therapy is, because to be honest, some people don't actually even understand what therapy is. So it's this thing of, well, why don't you go to therapy? Or, maybe I should try therapy. And there really isn't a clear understanding of what that actually is. And so it can be challenging on multiple levels. And so if someone were saying to someone else, well, why don't you just pray about it? Or why don't you go talk to, the bishop? Maybe that is something for them to do. But if you're the person who someone is saying that to, if someone is just saying to you, just lean into your faith more, just do that, it can be really tough, especially if you're trying to be grounded in your faith, to say, well, God is not enough, or, my faith, what I believe in is not enough. So I have to now go do something else, or I don't believe enough. So it can be really hard to tease that apart. But what I do is try to offer people options and really just kind of leave them with that, in terms of you don't actually have to go to therapy. And a lot of times I don't start necessarily with people coming to therapy. Those who come to me, they understand, they want to be there. But some people need a peer support group. And that might get them going enough to then say, oh, well, such and such, somebody else in my group is in therapy, or somebody else was talking about it. I didn't know that's what therapy was. And then there may be an openness to trying therapy. And so sometimes you can, if you're a person who's someone is to that, you can take that information. And if it fits for you, go talk to the bishop. And, and that's okay. And you still have other options. And so I think it's really important that we know, we mentioned Postpartum Support International. If you connect with them and the 833 TLC Mama, those are two resources that, if you don't even know what you don't know or what you need, you can get connected to both of those places and find resources, free support groups. Sisters in Loss has a free support groups for parents who have experienced loss. So you don't always have to necessarily start with this thing that may feel very stigmatized, but you can start someplace or close that may eventually get them the support that they need, if that's therapy or even medication. So I hope that answers the question.
It did very.
We have one more question that came in the Q&A, and I think it relates to the information that you mentioned about PSI. So the question is, how can mommies get help with PPD in states that are battling over reproductive justice laws?
Oh boy. That's a really tough one. It really is tough because it's an extra element of trying to understand where are you safe and what is safe for you to say and what that support going to look like. And so again, I think this is where Postpartum Support International can be really helpful. They have state advocates. And so each person who is that advocate for that state will be well aware of what are the laws and what's happening in the state that may impact the support. And from my experience up to date, just in some of the more recent legislation, they have been up to date and adjusting the support that is needed. But I will say it makes it much more challenging. It's very scary, even more scary for some of us to consider what our options are, given some of that, some of what is happening, for sure. Thank you for bringing that up.
And one more question just came in. Hopefully we can just take 2 minutes for this one.
Okay.
So I just had a question about perhaps biological or biopsychosocial explanations of postpartum depression. Why does the maternal drive to protect during pregnancy seem to become more difficult to access after birth?
Mhm. That's a good question and a complex one to answer. There's so much that can happen. Even as we were talking, I'll be brief, but what the pregnancy experience and that experience may inform and may really kind of trigger or enact that sense of protection and safety. But then along the birth experience and what is happening early after, those things and whatever may be in that space may contribute to it being more difficult for someone to be able to still kind of access that protective factor. It can also, I do want to say, for some people, the birth experience may trigger traumas that a person might not be fully even aware of from past experiences. And so if for some reason someone was triggered by a previous trauma, it may make it difficult for them to bond. So there are lots of things that can get in the way of that bonding or that sense of protection. So it may be more complex than just somehow I had it and now I feel like I don't. Um, so I know we had 2 minutes, but hopefully that answered. Thank you all so much. You have a lot of questions and engagement, so really appreciate it and hope it was helpful to you.